We're going to look today at a case that is, well, it's just stunning in its details. It's not just because of the senseless, targeted violence committed against a young, successful woman, Sherry Rasmussen, but because the truth behind her murder, which was concealed for decades, eventually led to this shocking revelation that her killer was a sworn officer of the law, a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department, Stephanie Lazarus.
Exactly. And this specific exploration is really about peeling back those layers. We're focusing intensely on institutional failure and the incredible cost of what you could call tunnel vision. The 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen was very quickly categorized by police as a botched burglary. But the evidence, which was available almost from day one, it really pointed toward a crime of passion.
Hmm.
So we have a narrative here that exposes how that crime was possibly concealed, and maybe even through the actions of a fellow officer, for 23 years. And that created just profound anguish for the family and raises these incredibly serious allegations of a potential cover-up within the LAPD.
So our mission here is to analyze the extensive material surrounding Sherry Rasmussen, her life, the specific details of that crime scene, the investigation that just stalled for years, and then, of course, the forensic breakthrough that finally cracked this cold case open, and the intense controversy that followed the arrest of one of their own. We really need to understand the full context of what happened to Sherry Rasmussen, who was thriving in her career and just preparing for her future when her life was so tragically cut short.
And we have to approach this material with the sensitivity and the focus it deserves. We're going to concentrate purely on the factual narrative that emerges from these sources. And it's also important to recognize the extraordinary determination that was required by the victim's family. They persistently pushed for justice, even when the system itself seemed absolutely determined to just ignore them. The implications of this story, they really touch on the credibility of investigative procedures everywhere.
So let's begin by understanding the dynamic that led up to that tragic day. The sources really frame this as the Ruetten-Lazarus dynamic. Sherry Rasmussen was, by all accounts, truly exceptional. She was born in 1957, started college early, graduated from Loma Linda University, and was already highly accomplished professionally by her late 20s.
Right. She earned her master's degree in nursing from UCLA in 1980 and then just rose through the ranks in critical care really quickly. By the time of her death, she wasn't just working as an unpaid assistant clinical professor of nursing. She had achieved the very prestigious position of director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. She was clearly a focused, ambitious, and successful woman.
And her professional success was paired with this very practical planning for her future. Her family was very involved.
Very. Her father, Nels Rasmussen, he worried about her safety. It makes sense, right? The demanding schedule of a director of nursing often involves working late nights. So to help ensure her security, he bought her a condo in Van Nuys, specifically one that was designed with a drive-in garage so she could pull her car directly inside and avoid, walking the streets late at night. She paid him rent, basically the monthly mortgage payment. It just shows not only her competence, but the deep level of family support she had, all rooted in this concern for her safety.
So Sherry meets John Ruetten in June of 1984 at a party, and they become a serious couple pretty quickly. But John had this previous and, as it turns out, very complicated history with another woman, Stephanie Lazarus. They had met as undergraduates at UCLA, living in the same residence hall, Dykstra Hall, between 1978 and 1982.
And the nature of that relationship is absolutely foundational to this crime because there was this severe imbalance in how the two of them viewed it. Lazarus, who was highly competitive, she'd played on UCLA's junior varsity women's basketball team. She clearly took the relationship far more seriously than Ruetten did.
How did he see it?
Well, Ruetten, in his later testimony, he described their sexual encounters, which happened about 20 to 30 times over several years. He used these really dismissive phrases, things like necking and fooling around. He stated unequivocally that he never considered her his girlfriend or intended the relationship to be long-term.
So on one side, you have a man who sees this as just casual college hookups. And on the other, you have Stephanie Lazarus, who internalized it as something much more serious. What was she doing professionally during this time?
Lazarus was also highly ambitious, but she chose a different path. After graduating, she decided against law school and instead entered the LAPD Academy in 1982. And this was a specific era for the LAPD. They were actively working to increase the number of women on the force after a major sex discrimination lawsuit. So she graduates, becomes a uniformed officer in 1983, and sets herself up in a condo in Granada Hills.
And there's one specific detail related to her early career choice that's really important here.
Yes, the detail that becomes tragically salient later on. Upon graduating from the academy, she purchased her backup firearm through the department. It was a Smith & Wesson Model 49.38 caliber revolver. Now, this was standard practice, but it means she legally acquired the exact type of weapon that would eventually be used in the murder. We also know from sources that during her training, she would sometimes refer to Ruetten as her college boyfriend, which just shows how much she was clinging to this connection in her own internal narrative. She even brought him as her date to a company Christmas party in 1983.
So the situation, which had been sort of low-key for a while, it starts to escalate dramatically when Ruetten and Sherry's commitment becomes public. In May of '85, Lazarus meets Sherry for the first time, and then the following month, she learns they're engaged, and the sources show Lazarus was just completely devastated.
The documentation of her despair is chilling. Her diary entry from that specific time reads, "I really don't feel like working. I found out that John is getting married. My concentration is like -10. The emotional impact was so severe that she woke her roommate, who was also a fellow officer, just to commiserate. And that officer later recalled having never seen Lazarus cry until that moment. This wasn't just sadness. For her, it was a profound crisis.
And what complicates this timeline even more is a really unfortunate decision Ruetten made right before he moved in with Sherry.
Yes. Ruetten testified that shortly before he and Sherry moved in together, he slept with Lazarus one last time. He later claimed this was to give her closure, which is a decision we can speculate was born from, a mix of guilt and maybe a desire to avoid confrontation. But crucially, he didn't tell Sherry about this final encounter. And that omission, it didn't just hurt his personal integrity, it severely compromised the credibility of his initial statements to the police, which added a whole other layer of complexity to the entire narrative.
So Lazarus was clearly not getting the closure that Ruetten intended. She wrote to her mother that August saying, "I'm truly in love with John, and the past year has really torn me up. I wish it didn't end the way it did, and I don't think I'll ever understand his decision." Nay. But the situation moves quickly from this sort of desperate melancholy to overt hostility and stalking behavior.
And this is where the threats against Sherry become explicit. Sometime that summer, Lazarus, who was off duty, paid a highly confrontational visit to Sherry at her workplace. She arrived wearing tight short shorts and a tank top, clearly intended to emphasize her attractiveness, and she immediately tried to assert dominance. She told Sherry that she was still having sex with Ruetten and warned her that when the marriage inevitably failed, I'll be there to pick up the pieces.
How did Sherry respond to that kind of direct confrontation?
Well, Sherry, understandably, confronted Ruetten about it. He admitted the infidelity and asked for forgiveness, but he didn't take any proactive steps to stop Lazarus from contacting them further. Sherry, though, was very direct with Lazarus. She responded, "Your services won't be needed." But Lazarus was not deterred. As she was leaving, she delivered this chilling, very specific threat. "If I can't have John, no one else will, including you."
That sounds less like a heartbroken woman and more like a possessive threat, especially coming from someone trained in law enforcement. But despite this, the wedding went ahead in November 1985. Did the harassment stop then?
Absolutely not. The hang-up calls started occasionally, which Lazarus herself later admitted during her 2023 parole hearing that she was responsible for. And that shows as calculated harassment, not just some spur-of-the-moment emotional outburst. The couple even installed a burglar alarm before their honeymoon, which possibly reflects their growing anxiety. Although a friend noted the code they chose, their wedding anniversary, 11/23, was not the most secure choice.
And the confrontations just kept happening, even after the marriage.
They did. In January of 1986, Lazarus showed up at their condo under the pretense of having Ruetten wax her skis, again dressed in flattering workout clothes, despite Sherry's clear objections. And Ruetten minimized the significance, convincing Sherry they were just friends. But the unsettling pattern continued. A few days later, Lazarus returned in uniform to pick up the skis. And then on another occasion later that month, Sherry actually found Lazarus in full police uniform inside their living room after Ruetten had already left for work. Sherry firmly asked her to leave, and she did.
The audacity of that, repeatedly showing up in her official uniform, must have been profoundly intimidating to Sherry.
Oh, it was an incredible abuse of her authority and her status to intimidate a civilian. Sherry confided in her father, Nels, telling him she feared Lazarus was stalking her, sometimes even posing as a young man to watch the apartment. And crucially, she told Nels she didn't believe that reporting it to the police would be effective, a truly tragic premonition of how the LAPD would ultimately handle the case.
So we see this clear trajectory. A perceived betrayal leading to an explicit threat, followed by months of escalating stalking and harassment, all documented by the victim and her family. That is the stage that's set for February 1986. Okay, so let's move to February 24th, 1986, the day Sherry was murdered. John Ruetten left their Van Nuys condo around 7:2 in the morning. Sherry had sustained a minor back injury during an aerobics class the day before, so she was planning to call in sick, which means she was home when the attack occurred.
The timeline here is really important. Ruetten made several unanswered calls home throughout the day. Sherry's sister called as well and also got no response. What's particularly relevant to the timeline of the attack is that around noon, a maid in a neighboring unit reported hearing something. She said it sounded distinctly like two people fighting, followed by something heavy falling. She heard no gunshots, but she just dismissed the sound as a domestic dispute and never contacted the authorities.
When Ruetten returned that evening, he knew something was terribly wrong right away. He noticed broken glass on the driveway and then realized Sherry's car, a BMW 318i, was missing. Inside, he found Sherry dead on the living room floor. She'd been shot 3 times in the chest.
And the ammunition used was federal .38J plus P.
The physical evidence at the scene, it just spoke volumes about the sheer violence of what happened.
It did, and the nature of the confrontation. The struggle was not brief. Based on forensic observations, it was estimated to have lasted anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half, which is an extraordinarily long duration for any type of attack, especially a burglary. And the signs of this intense fight were everywhere. A broken porcelain vase, a toppled credenza, and critically, a bloody handprint found near the burglar alarm's panic button. It suggests Sherry was trying desperately to summon help. She was found in her bathrobe, nightgown, and underwear, indicating she was surprised early in the day.
The autopsy details, they really underline the sheer brutality of the attack and offer these crucial insights into the assailant's behavior.
They really do. Sherry sustained a total of 15 separate injuries on her body and face. Notably, there was a laceration of the frenulum, which is the small piece of tissue connecting the lip to the gum. That strongly suggests a forceful, violent blow to the mouth. There's also a distinct bruise on her face that medical examiners determined was inflicted by the muzzle of a gun. This indicates the attacker used the weapon not just to shoot, but as a blunt force instrument, suggesting this aggressive confrontation before the fatal shots.
And then there's the one piece of evidence that would end up defining the case decades later.
Yes, the bite mark. The investigating criminalist meticulously observed a distinct bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm. Standard procedure was followed. A swab was taken from this bite mark for blood typing, and then it was stored. This minuscule piece of evidence, just a saliva sample, was the silent witness that survived decades of institutional neglect and would ultimately hold the truth.
Let's talk about the specific evidence that pointed away from a random crime. It seems the scene was staged.
It absolutely screamed staging. First, the method of shooting. The gun was fired through a quilted blanket. That's clearly an improvised silencer intended to muffle the sound, suggesting premeditation and a desire to control the noise, unlike a chaotic struggle. Second, the supposed motivation. Electronics, including stereo equipment and a VCR, were stacked neatly at the base of the stairs, supposedly waiting to be carried out. And third, the missing car. The BMW was stolen, but it was recovered just 11 days later, only 2 miles away. Unlocked, with the keys still in the ignition. Burglars typically don't steal a victim's car and then abandon it unlocked so close to the scene.
And the single item missing from the house, besides the car, that tells us so much about the emotional motive, doesn't it?
It does. The only other item reported missing was the couple's marriage license. That combination of electronics stacked, valuables ignored, but the marriage license taken is deeply, profoundly atypical for a financial crime. It immediately points to an emotionally driven crime where the goal was symbolic destruction, not monetary gain.
Yet, despite all these red flags, the long struggle, the staging, the missing license, the initial LAPD lead detectives, Lyle Mayer and Steve Hooks, they quickly fixed on this theory of a botched burglary. Why?
Well, they had a powerful institutional bias toward making the case fit a known pattern, and unfortunately, burglary was an easier box to check. The factors arguing against it were numerous. A long struggle duration, the fact that jewelry was left in plain sight, the car theft and abandonment. And crucially, even Detective Hooks, Mayer's partner, noted the bite mark was unusual. He observed that bites inflicted during struggles are much more commonly inflicted by women, end quote. So to rationalize this, they adopted a theory of 2 burglars, a man and a woman, to somehow keep the burglary narrative intact without considering the obvious alternative, a singular female assailant driven by emotion.
This brings us to the absolutely critical failure of that initial investigation, the immediate dismissal of the actual named suspect. The Rasmussens were trying desperately to get the police to look at Lazarus.
Nils and Loretta Rasmussen went directly to Detective Mayer, and they laid out the entire history. Lazarus's harassment, her visits to the office, and that explicit threat. If I can't have John, no one else will, including you.
Mm.
And Mayer took notes on this information. But he dismissed it entirely. He told Nils Rasmussen there's nothing there, cementing this disastrous focus on the botched burglary theory.
Wait a second. If the father provided specific, credible threats naming the suspect, why would a detective dismiss it out of hand? Was it just tunnel vision, or is there something else going on?
It was likely a combination of factors. First, Ruetten complicated things. While he testified, he did mention Lazarus as a former lover when police asked about a jealous ex-partner the morning after the crime. He deliberately withheld the details of the final sexual encounter and, critically, the confrontation where Lazarus threatened Sherry. He testified he did this out of shame and a desire to protect his reputation. So his minimization of their relationship made Lazarus seem less relevant. And second, once the LAPD commits to a theory, reversing course is professionally very difficult. They simply disregarded the Rasmussens, treating them like emotional family members rather than eyewitness informants about the pre-crime harassment.
So because the victim's own husband downplayed the severity of the threat, and the detectives preferred the easy explanation of a burglary, the one person who publicly threatened Sherry was instantly excluded from suspicion.
Exactly. And that failure resulted in 2 decades of injustice.
With the botched burglary theory so firmly established, despite all the contradictory evidence, the case just stalled out very quickly. By the late 1980s, the LAPD had shifted its resources dramatically to address the overwhelming gang wars and the crack epidemic that was gripping Los Angeles. The Rasmussen murder simply fell to the bottom of the pile.
And this is where we see the immense psychological toll and the sheer determination of the Rasmussen family. They were, for all intents and purposes, the only investigative entity left. When they would call the Van Nuys office seeking updates, they were just met with institutional apathy. They reported that detectives were often unhelpful, that they would hang up or put them on indefinite hold. John Ruetten himself only stayed in the condo for about a month after the murder. He found the psychological and financial burden too heavy and eventually moved back to his parents' home in San Diego. So the family was left alone to fight for justice.
And Nils Rasmussen, Sherry's father, he became relentless. He consistently pushed the LAPD, refusing to let the case die.
He did. He wrote directly to the then chief, Daryl Cates, specifically reiterating his suspicions about Lazarus and offering reward money, just trying to force a reinvestigation.
And the response he got?
It was dismissive, even condescending. The sources revealed that detectives actually told Nils Rasmussen he watched too much television, implying his theories were just based on fiction, not fact. But the family's objections were sound. They logically doubted the official story. Sherry was 6 feet tall, had a large frame, she was physically fit. They questioned how a male burglar could have subdued her in a struggle that lasted over an hour. Nels, recognizing the use of the quilt, he believed the murder was a deliberate, targeted killing, not some chaotic, accidental outcome of a break-in.
And while the Rasmussen family was essentially doing the detective work, trying to keep the case alive, Stephanie Lazarus's career was flourishing inside the LAPD.
She was thriving. She had stinks in various desirable divisions, including DARE, background investigations, internal affairs. She was earning a reputation for being thorough and meticulous. She's promoted to detective in 1994, and eventually she specialized in art theft, which is a high-profile, sort of glamorous assignment that sometimes brought her local media attention. She was building this solid, respected career while concealing a deadly secret.
And that professional advancement tragically placed her in a position of access.
It absolutely did. The institutional access is highly suspicious. For 2 separate periods during the 1990s, Lazarus was assigned to the Van Nuys division. This is the exact building and office space where the Rasmussen murder book, the entire physical case file, was kept and was easily accessible to detectives. Even more critically, colleagues recalled that Lazarus frequently volunteered for overnight shifts when the detective office was unsupervised. This gave her unfettered access to the physical records containing the evidence against her, including the notes detailing her own threats against the victim.
So we have this decade where the prime suspect, who is now a respected detective, had the physical opportunity to review and potentially tamper with the evidence of her own crime. Were there specific investigative failures that happened during this cold period?
Oh yes, and they are heartbreaking. In 1993, 7 years after the crime, Nils Rasmussen offered to pay for DNA testing, which was available by then. He said he'd pay for it if the LAPD would just run the existing samples. But the police told him they needed a suspect first, which created this circular logic that prevented any forensic progress. That decision alone cost the case years of delay, during which time a crucial piece of evidence, the bite mark DNA, could have immediately ruled out the male burglar theory.
And there was another significant lead that was just tragically missed.
In 1997, a former co-worker of Sherry's secretary contacted police specifically about that January 1986 incident where Lazarus had confronted Sherry in her office. This was direct corroboration of the harassment that Nels had reported, and yet police failed to follow up on this critical lead before the secretary died 3 years later. The initial disastrous tunnel vision on the burglary meant that any information pointing away from that theory was just systematically ignored or not properly investigated, allowing Lazarus to continue her professional ascent unimpeded.
The ultimate turning point, the scientific breakthrough, finally arrived in the late 90s, early 2000s, when DNA testing became a standard component of cold case reviews. The LAPD formed a unit to specifically review older cases. When the Rasmussen case was pulled, key evidence from a minor 1993 reinvestigation was already noted as missing, suggesting ongoing problems with the case file's integrity. Fortunately, the bite swab, the one taken in 1986, it was eventually located in the coroner's office freezers after initially being listed as missing from the property log.
A criminalist named Jennifer Francis took on the analysis of the bite mark swab in 2004, and her findings were immediate, definitive, and should have been revolutionary for the investigation. The saliva found in the bite swab came from a female. This was proof that the long-held, nearly 20-year-old botched burglary theory was completely false. The physical evidence pointed to a female perpetrator who had engaged in intimate, violent contact with the victim.
That's a huge shift. If the lab proves the attacker was female, the entire investigative focus has to change.
Should have. Francis, who was very thorough, had access not just to the physical sample, but to the entire case file. So she reviewed the file and found that initial notes from 1986 mentioned a third-party female who had harassed the victim at her job and residence prior to the murder.
And this is where the alleged institutional resistance comes in, threatening to bury the truth all over again. What happened when Francis connected the female DNA finding to the female harassment suspect in the file?
Francis asked her supervising detective if this woman had been investigated, and was met with a 30. Just an astonishing response. The detective allegedly replied, "Oh, you mean the LAPD detective," confirming that they were aware of the history with Lazarus. Francis, who had overlooked the vague reference to Lazarus's police status in the file, was then immediately told by the supervising detective that Lazarus, the former girlfriend of the victim's husband, was not a part of this. He insisted the case was merely a burglary committed by a man and woman working together, aligning perfectly with the department's decades-old, comfortable conclusion.
That sounds like a clear, deliberate intervention to protect a fellow officer from scientific evidence. How did Francis handle that?
It really speaks to the environment of internal protection, the blue wall of silence, that she felt compelled to challenge it. Francis alleged that she was pressured to ignore the Lazarus angle, and that she faced significant retaliation and harassment for accurately reporting her findings and daring to raise concerns about police interference in this case and other high-profile cases.
And she eventually took legal action over this.
She did. She filed an unsuccessful lawsuit against the city claiming misconduct. And while the lawsuit failed, the sources clearly established her concern that once the identity of the harassment suspect was linked to the LAPD, the investigation was internally shut down, despite the scientific evidence pointing directly toward a female perpetrator. The implication is profound. A system was actively prioritizing the protection of one of its own over the pursuit of justice for the victim.
So this crucial DNA evidence, which should have led to an arrest in 2004, it was shelved for another 4 years.
Exactly. No other detective pursued the female suspect angle. The DNA results went right back into the cold files, maintaining the department's public narrative and allowing Lazarus to continue her career as a detective for 4 more years.
Thankfully, the file didn't stay buried forever. The case finally received a fresh and frankly accidental look in 2008. A Van Nuys homicide detective, Jim Nuttall, found the voluminous Rasmussen file just left near his desk. He and his partner, Pete Barba, decided to review it from scratch.
And they immediately saw the flaws. They quickly agreed that the bite mark DNA, pointing definitively to a female suspect, made the established burglary theory completely unsustainable. They decided to discard the initial findings and treat the crime as what the evidence suggested, a deliberate murder with a staged burglary, starting their analysis from zero.
What specifically about the crime scene staging convinced them it was a deliberate cover-up, not just an accident?
Their re-examination focused on the inconsistencies the original detectives had ignored. For example, the gated complex, the lack of forced entry, and the fact that high-value jewelry was left untouched. But the most damning evidence for the staving theory was that stack of stereo equipment at the base of the stairs. If a chaotic, prolonged 90-minute struggle had actually occurred down the stairs, that stack should have been scattered. It was just too neat.
And the forensics confirmed the staging.
Yes. They noticed a key detail in the original crime scene photos. A thumb-shaped bloodstain was found on a record player that was on top of the neat stack. The blood belonged to Sherry Rasmussen, and the shape of the stain suggested the person who placed it there was wearing gloves, as there was no print. This strongly suggested the equipment had been stacked after the struggle and shooting to fabricate the appearance of a botched robbery, an act of specific concealment that only the killer would have a reason to perform.
So, with the theory confirmed, it was a staged murder by a female. Where did they look next?
They compiled a list of 5 female suspects mentioned in the 4 bound volumes of the murder book. Lazarus was initially ranked as the least promising, precisely because Rowetton had minimized their relationship to the original 1986 detectives. But after eliminating the other 4 suspects, including a disgruntled nurse, Lazarus, now a high-ranking art theft detective, became their sole focus. Detective Nuttall was apparently taken aback when he realized the person at the center of their murder investigation was a respected, active LAPD officer.
This presented an enormous operational challenge. How do you investigate one of your own, especially someone who works in the same building?
Operational security became paramount. Detectives Nuttall and Barba kept their work a closely guarded secret. They referred to Lazarus only by the code name Number 5. This was an essential measure because Lazarus's husband was also a detective of the Van Nuys division. They feared she would be tipped off, giving her time to destroy evidence or fabricate an alibi. The risk of smearing a fellow officer if she turned out to be innocent also mandated absolute secrecy.
They then started digging into her history and her equipment. What did they find regarding the potential murder weapon?
They found confirmation that she had legally purchased a .38 backup firearm, the same caliber used in the murder. Then came the major, highly incriminating discovery. 13 days after Sherry Rasmussen was killed, Lazarus reported her .38 stolen to the Santa Monica police. But here's the critical procedural violation. She failed to report it to the LAPD armorer, which was strictly required by department policy for any loss of a duty weapon.
Why is that omission so important?
Well, investigators theorized that she had disposed of the weapon, perhaps throwing it into the Pacific Ocean near the Santa Monica Pier, where she claimed it was stolen, or maybe burying it. They concluded she chose this route because losing a duty gun, or failing to prevent its theft, carried severe professional penalties, including potential loss of rank or internal discipline. By reporting it stolen to Santa Monica police, she established a paper trail that satisfied initial inquiries, but by failing to notify the LAPD armorer, she avoided the immediate mandatory internal investigation that would have checked the weapon status and her activities leading up to the alleged theft. It strongly suggested she was covering her tracks professionally.
So they had motive, they had access, a staged crime scene, and a missing gun that was reported stolen in a highly suspicious manner. All they needed was that final link.
Exactly. They needed a fresh DNA sample. They carefully avoided seeking a warrant that might have alerted Lazarus to the investigation. Instead, they opted for a covert collection strategy based on discarded evidence. While off-duty, Lazarus discarded a cup she had been drinking from at a Simi Valley Costco. Other police officers operating under deep cover retrieved the cup. The DNA profile from that cup was run against the saliva sample from the 1986 bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm.
And the result?
It was an absolute match. The evidentiary circle was closed. The DNA from the bite mark belonged to Stephanie Lazarus, the LAPD detective who had threatened Sherry Rasmussen decades earlier.
The arrest operation in June of 2009 must have been meticulously planned, given her status and her training.
It was a masterful exercise in operational security. The case was transferred to the Robbery Homicide Division, or RHD, for final handling. Chief William Bratton personally mandated that the arrest be conducted at Parker Center, LAPD headquarters, under the guise of an art theft meeting. This was a critical step because entering the headquarters required Lazarus to check her firearm and equipment belt upon entry, disarming her before the interview even began.
And the interrogation itself, how did that go?
Detectives Stearns and Jaramillo interviewed her. They knew she was well-versed in police interview techniques, so they used a very strategic approach. They told Lazarus they wanted to tie up some loose ends privately to protect her reputation, implying Rutan was merely an old boyfriend who had been unfaithful. They were trying to get her to minimize her involvement without admitting to the murder. Lazarus initially recalled very little, but then gradually admitted some vague knowledge of her visits to the condo and Sherry's office. It was only when the detectives mentioned the existence of DNA evidence that she became visibly nervous and suspicious. She stated she needed to speak with someone and left the room, where she was immediately arrested. The shock and betrayal among the force were enormous.
Following her arrest, Lazarus was allowed to retire early from the LAPD, which actually allowed her to retain her pension, though she was held on $10 million bail. The trial finally began in early 2012. Given the sensational nature of this love triangle and the accused being a high-ranking officer, the media attention was just intense.
The prosecution, led by Shannon Presby, presented a very clear, jealousy-driven motive, which he famously summarized as a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart. Ruetten testified, visibly emotional, confirming his infidelity was a mistake that had cost Sherry her life. The jury needed only a few days of deliberation to convict Lazarus of first-degree murder in March 2012. She was sentenced to 27 years to life, a sentence that was upheld on appeal in 2015.
But the trial, while it secured justice for Sherry, it simultaneously exposed these massive systemic failures in the initial 1986 investigation that went far beyond simple error.
Absolutely. The list of failures is staggering. Crucially, recordings and transcripts of initial interviews where Nels Rasmussen and potentially Ruetten discussed Lazarus were just missing from the official case file. Ruetten even recalled being asked by the police to take off his shirt and being photographed without it early on to check for defensive scratches, suggesting police may have found evidence that Sherry had injured her attacker, evidence that was never officially documented in the investigative notes.
That detail about the scratches is critical. It implies the 1986 detectives knew there was a high likelihood the attacker was injured. But what about the physical evidence that was simply mishandled or ignored?
The bloody fingerprint is a severe example. A bloody fingerprint was found on a digital disc player, most likely left by the suspect, perhaps when staging the robbery, and it was noted by criminalists. However, it was never properly collected, photographed in identifiable detail, or preserved. The disc player itself wasn't even taken into evidence. If that had been handled correctly, this print could have immediately implicated or excluded suspects back in 1986, yet it was just lost to time due to negligence or, some would say, deliberate oversight.
This brings us to the serious allegations of evidence tampering and institutional malfeasance raised by subsequent investigations into the cold case file's integrity. These go beyond mere incompetence, and they hint at deliberate sabotage.
That's right. One of the most prominent discrepancies uncovered was the complete absence of the handwritten accounts of investigative actions, the chrono, from the first 3 months after the murder. LAPD protocol at the time strictly required these handwritten records. They're essentially the daily diary of the investigation. When Detective Nuttall reviewed the file in 2008, these fundamental notes were just gone.
Why would someone remove those specific initial handwritten notes? What's the thinking there?
Well, one reason is that they would contain the most explicit, unedited records of the early investigation, likely including Nels Rasmussen's report of Lazarus's threats, any attempts by police to look for a non-burglary suspect, and any observations about the staging before the official narrative took hold. Removing the chrono effectively removes the roadmap of the investigation, making it much harder to spot inconsistencies later on.
And the typed records that replaced them were equally suspicious.
They were structurally compromised. The typed chronological record consistently misspelled Ruetten's last name as Ruetter. It seems like a small error, but it could have severely hindered database searches for related information within police archives. Furthermore, the typed chrono lacked the required detective initials, and it displayed consistent spacing and typeface throughout, strongly suggesting it was typed in a single sitting, potentially years after the fact, rather than compiled chronologically as the investigation unfolded.
And the timeline for these strange discrepancies, the missing original chronos, the compromised typed record, it aligns disturbingly with the time Lazarus had access to the Van Nuys files in the 1990s.
It creates an almost undeniable inference. The sources point out that these procedural failures occurred during the years when Lazarus, by then a detective, was assigned to the very division where the murder book was kept, often volunteering for those unsupervised overnight shifts. While proving she personally removed or altered the records is nearly impossible, the correlation between her access, her motive, and the state of the official file is devastating. It suggests that institutional access allowed her the opportunity to cover her tracks professionally for a decade.
The Rasmussen family, believing they were failed by the entire department, then pursued legal action against the city.
They sued the city, alleging that Lazarus committed the murder and that the LAPD had actively abetted her cover-up efforts for over 2 decades. They weren't just seeking justice for the initial crime, they were seeking accountability for the institutional failure that allowed the killer to remain free and employed for 23 years.
So how did the LAPD respond to that specific allegation of an institutional cover-up?
The internal affairs investigation into the cover-up allegation was, according to the sources, quietly closed after Lazarus's conviction sustained the first allegation of murder. The second, more sensitive allegation that the LAPD covered up the crime was ruled unfounded, despite the mountain of evidence detailing procedural failures, missing records, and the internal pressure faced by criminalists like Jennifer Francis. This ruling was criticized heavily by journalists who described the internal investigation as essentially a sham, reflecting a deep unwillingness within the police culture to investigate itself for fear of looking bad. This decision is one of the most lasting wounds of the entire case.
Due to a specific California law, which allows special parole consideration for those convicted of crimes committed while they were under the age of 26, Lazarus became eligible for parole in the early 2020s, decades sooner than many would have expected.
And this eligibility brought about the final dramatic reversal in Lazarus's narrative. For years, she had maintained her innocence, appealing her conviction. But in November of 2023, facing the parole board, she abandoned her claims of innocence and confessed to the murder.
What was the nature of her confession? Did it seem genuine?
She presented the crime as an impulsive act of rage, stating, "It makes me sick to this day that I took an oath to protect and serve people, and I took Sherry Rasmussen's life from her, a nurse." She claimed she had gone to the condo and planned only to tie Rasmussen up if she got on my way to see John, leading to what she described as a hellacious bar fight. She claimed she then bound Rasmussen with cord, shot her, and disposed of the gun out of immediate fear of being suspected.
How did the victim's family and John Ruetten react to this confession and her parole eligibility?
They strongly opposed parole. They argued that the murder was not the impulsive act of a love-struck young woman, but a calculated act that utilized her police training, followed by an elaborate 2-decade cover-up. Detective Stearns, speaking for the prosecution, specifically noted that her preparation improvising a silencer with the quilt and covering up the crime professionally were not the hallmarks of youthful offense. They are the hallmarks of criminal sophistication and maturity.
The family's opposition must have been just profoundly emotional.
It was. A video Nels Rasmussen recorded before his death in 2020 was played, in which he noted the severity of the damage inflicted upon Sherry's face. He suggested Lazarus wanted to destroy the beauty that Sherry exuded. Ruetten maintained that Lazarus's confession was merely a cynical ploy to gain parole, asking why, if she felt so much remorse, she had spent 23 years lying and denying the crime.
Initially, parole was granted, but that decision was quickly reviewed.
The initial grant was reviewed and eventually rescinded by the full parole board in October 2024. A subsequent request in 2025 was denied, based specifically on the fundamental discrepancies between Lazarus's confession and the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene decades earlier.
What were the key discrepancies the parole commissioner focused on?
The parole commissioner, Kevin Chappell, highlighted that the minimal amount of Lazarus's DNA found on the bite mark swab did not support her detailed account of a prolonged struggle or a hellacious bar fight. He concluded that the evidence suggested she was the only one engaging in this extreme act of violence, minimizing Sherry's ability to fight back in the manner Lazarus described. Furthermore, the prosecutor, Paul Nunez, questioned Lazarus's claim that the gun fell out of a fanny pack during the struggle, and strongly suggested that Lazarus likely used her police training to pick the lock, knowing Rasmussen was home alone rather than Rasmussen simply opening the door.
So this denial, based on the forensic evidence that she herself helped try to bury, ensures she remains incarcerated for now.
It does. Lazarus will be eligible for parole again in 2028. But the ongoing scrutiny over the accuracy of her confession highlights the lasting difficulty in obtaining the complete truth, even after a conviction. She seems to be still attempting to control the narrative of her crime, framing it as an impulsive act rather than the calculated homicide that the physical evidence and the prolonged staging suggest.
This analysis highlights, first and foremost, the unwavering determination of Sherry Rasmussen's family, especially Nels Rasmussen. His insistence eventually forced a long-delayed reinvestigation despite decades of institutional inertia and repeated dismissals by detectives who should have been listening. We must remember Sherry Rasmussen, a highly accomplished nurse whose fear of her stalker was so tragically realized.
And what is fascinating here is the power of a single, tiny piece of biological evidence, the DNA from that bite mark. It eventually revealed the long-concealed truth, exposing profound and significant questions about accountability and transparency within the initial police investigation itself. The DNA told a story that the department initially refused to hear or perhaps actively suppressed.
The ultimate question that remains is, how much did institutional protection and the desire to avoid bad publicity allow an officer to conceal a murder for over 2 decades? The failure to collect key evidence, the missing investigative records, and the internal suppression of forensic findings. It forces us to consider the fragility of justice when investigative systems fail to question assumptions, especially when an officer of the law is the subject of suspicion.
And this raises an important question for you, the listener, as you reflect on this story. What does the revelation of potential evidence tampering and organizational cover-up in a case like this tell us about the long-term cost of initial tunnel vision in law enforcement investigations, both to the victim and to public trust?
Thank you for joining us for this analysis of the sources surrounding the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Thanks for listening.